May 3, 1945. A wind-battered transit camp on the outskirts of Bremen. 38 German women stumbled off a Bedford lorry into the drizzling rain. Their Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms hung from gaunt frames. Their eyes were hollow, darkened by weeks of retreat and terror. They had been told one absolute truth about the British. They are refined on the surface, brutal beneath. They will use civilized words while committing univilized acts. Death before dishonor. Death before capture. So when Greta Hoffmann, age 26, collapsed onto the wet gravel, her grey uniform dress darkening with fresh blood, the other women began to scream. They were certain the execution had begun. But the British soldiers didn't raise their rifles. They sprinted forward with medical bags, their boots splashing through puddles, their faces showing not rage, but urgent concern. Greta managed 5 words before unconsciousness took her. "It blew mine. Clyde, I'm bleeding through my dress." What happened in the next 96 hours didn't just save her life. It shattered everything these women believed about the enemy, about themselves, about the war they had served. They expected punishment. They got penicillin. They expected starvation. They got tea, fresh bread, and tinned fruit. They expected the cold brutality of victors. They found something far more devastating. Decency. And that decency broke them in ways no weapon ever could. This is the true story of 38 German women prisoners and the British mercy that destroyed their world. If you love forgotten stories from history that challenge everything you thought you knew about war, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss these untold tales. Like this video if you want more hidden World War II stories. And please stay until the end. Because what these women discovered in a British camp will change how you think about enemies, honor, and what it truly means to remain human when the world has gone mad. Let's begin. The gravel was dark with rain. Greta Hoffmann felt it first. That wet cold seeping through her worn boots as she stepped down from the lorry into the processing area of Transit Camp B7 just outside the shattered city of Bremen. Around her 37 other women descended into the same grey morning, their Nacrian Hellerin and Stabs Hellerin uniforms stained with mud and worse, their faces carrying the exhaustion of a Reich that was breathing its last breaths. May 3, 1945. Hitler had been dead for 3 days, though many of them didn't know it yet. Berlin had fallen. The war was over in everything but official declaration. And here, in a hastily erected British processing camp, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, 38 German women stood in loose formation, waiting to learn their fate. The propaganda had been explicit, repeated in training sessions, whispered in barracks, reinforced by officers right up until the moment of capture. The British are the most dangerous enemy because they hide their cruelty behind manners. They will torture you with politeness. They will violate you while calling it civilization. Better to die fighting than to surrender to British hypocrisy. These warnings had been drilled into them for years. Over 450,000 German women served in military auxiliary roles during the war. Those who fell into Soviet hands faced horrors that matched every terrible prediction. Surely the British, despite their reputation for restraint, would be no different. War stripped away pretense. The British would reveal their true nature soon enough. But what struck Greta first wasn't violence. It was the smell. Tea. Real tea. Not the ersat leaf substitute they'd been drinking for years, but actual tea. The scent drifted from somewhere beyond the processing tents, mixing with the smell of wet canvas, diesel exhaust, and wood smoke. Beneath it all, something clean, carbolic soap. The British were using real soap. Greta inhaled deeply, and the act made her dizzy. Or perhaps it was the pain, that grinding, tearing sensation in her lower abdomen that had been building for 5 days now. She had told no one. Showing weakness meant being left behind. Being left behind meant death, either from the advancing Soviets in the east or from German military police executing deserters in the chaos of retreat. So she had pressed her hand against her stomach during the long journey westward, bitten her tongue until she tasted blood, and kept walking. Now standing in the British camp with rain soaking through her uniform, she felt something warm trickling down her inner thigh. She looked down. The hem of her grey dress was darkening, not from rain, from blood. Fresh red spreading. Greta. The voice belonged to Laisel Brown, her closest friend since training in 1943. Liesel's eyes went wide with horror. Greta, du blutest, you're bleeding. To Dutchman Clyde, Greta whispered. I'm bleeding through my dress. Then the gravel rushed up to meet her. She collapsed forward, her body hitting the wet stones with a sound that cut through the rain, through the murmured voices, through everything. For one frozen heartbeat, nothing moved. The German women stood paralyzed, their minds racing to the darkest conclusions. The British had done something. The violence had begun. This was how it started. Then the screaming began. Leigh Sale shrieked, dropping to her knees beside Greta's crumpled body. Other women scattered backward, certain they were witnessing the first execution. Margareta Clean, the oldest among them at 43, grabbed two younger women and pulled them away, her face twisted with terror and rage. "Sie haben sie erschossen," someone screamed in German. "They've shot her." But no shots had been fired. No violence had occurred. What happened next defied everything the Rye had taught them about British cruelty. Two British medical orderlies sprinted across the gravel. They wore khaki battle dress with Red Cross armbands, their faces showing not hostility but professional urgency. Behind them came a stretcher team, 4 men moving with practiced efficiency. A medical officer, Major Edmund Hartley, according to the nameplate on his uniform, dropped his clipboard and ran. His stethoscope bouncing against his chest. "Make way. Stand back." The commands were in English, harsh and authoritative, but the gestures were universal. The German women parted, some still weeping, others frozen in shock. Leigh Sale remained crouched over Greta's body, trying to shield her friend with her own small frame, tears streaming down her face. "Bitte nein, bitte, please, no, please." One of the orderlies, a young man with sandy hair and gentle eyes, knelt beside her. "Miss, we need to help your friend. Please, let us help." Leigh Sale didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. It was genuinely concerned. She moved back, trembling. Major Hartley knelt in the wet gravel, heedless of his uniform. He pressed 2 fingers to Greta's throat, checking for a pulse. "Pulse is weak, but steady. She's lost blood. Get that stretcher here now." An orderly cut away the fabric of Greta's dress with surgical scissors, exposing the source of hemorrhage. An untreated wound in her lower abdomen, likely shrapnel from an artillery barrage that had caught their convoy during retreat. The wound had become infected. It had reopened during the rough journey to the camp. Leigh Sale watched, unable to process what she was seeing. A British officer kneeling in mud and rain, working frantically to save a German woman's life. This wasn't possible. This violated everything she'd been taught. Major Hartley looked up, his eyes finding Leigh's. He pointed to the Red Cross on his armband. His German was poor, heavily accented, but clear enough. "Wir helfen. We help. Understand?" Leigh Sale could only nod, mute with shock. Within 4 minutes, Greta was on a stretcher being loaded into an ambulance. The vehicle was a converted Austin-painted olive drab with a large red cross on white background. Through the open rear doors, Leigh Sale glimpsed a clean interior, real medical equipment, oxygen cylinders, supplies arranged on metal racks, nothing like the desperate aid stations she'd seen during the war, where wounded soldiers lay on straw with barely enough bandages to staunch bleeding. As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle drove away, its bell clanging urgently, Frieda Richter spoke. She was a former battlefield nurse, 34 years old, who had seen more death than anyone should. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence that had fallen over the group, every woman heard, "They're saving her. The British are actually saving her." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of their universe. The enemy was supposed to be cruel. Captivity was supposed to mean suffering. That's what they'd been told. That's what they'd believed. But if that was a lie, what else had been lies? The question was too dangerous to speak aloud. But as British soldiers led them toward the processing tents, passing guards who looked bored rather than bloodthirsty, every woman felt doubt growing in her chest. Small and terrible and impossible to ignore. 4 months earlier, they had been cogs in the machinery of the Reich. Not warriors, but the administrative backbone of the Wehrmacht. The radio operators, the telephone girls, the nurses, the clerks who kept German military operations running. Greta Hoffmann had joined the Narrenhelleren in 1941. She was 22 then, a university graduate from Hamburg with proficiency in English and some French. The recruiter promised her meaningful work. A chance to serve the fatherland in its hour of need. So she learned to operate radio equipment to decode messages through static to relay orders across vast distances. She believed she was part of something greater than herself. Leigh Sale Brown had no choice. At 18, her conscription notice arrived. Report to training, learn to type, file reports, answer telephones, man communication switchboards. She had wanted to study literature. Instead, she became a signals operator in a Wehrmacht headquarters in Belgium, connecting calls between officers who spoke of victories that never came and retreats that never ended. Frieda Richter volunteered in 1939 when Germany still seemed invincible. She was a qualified nurse and wounded soldiers needed care. For 6 years, she worked in field hospitals, first in Poland, then France, then the nightmare that was the Eastern Front. She had held dying boys in her arms, whispering lies about how they'd be fine. She knew exactly what war was. She knew it destroyed everything it touched. By May 1945, they all knew the Reich was finished. The British and Americans had crossed the Rhine. The Soviets had taken Berlin. Hitler was dead, though many didn't know it yet. Infrastructure collapsed. Orders stopped coming. Units dissolved. They were captured on April the 26th during the chaotic British advance through northern Germany. Their signals unit attached to a Wehrmacht garrison near Osnabrück had been retreating eastward when British armored columns cut them off. The male soldiers surrendered immediately. The officers fled. The women were left standing in a muddy field with their hands raised. Terrified. A British captain had walked through their ranks, young and sunburned, his accent clipped and precise. "You are prisoners of war. You will be processed according to the Geneva Convention. Follow orders and you will not be harmed." The Geneva Convention. The words sounded like fantasy. They had been told what capture meant. During training, the warnings had been explicit. The British are sophisticated torturers. They will break you with psychological methods. They will use kindness as a weapon to extract information, then discard you. Never trust British civility. It's a mask over barbarity. The propaganda had saturated their world. Newsreels showed British bombers destroying German cities. Radio broadcasts described P-camps where prisoners were starved and worked to death. One particularly vivid poster in their barracks showed a British officer smiling while German prisoners collapsed behind him. The caption, "This is British mercy." So when the lorries came to transport them westward, the women prepared for the worst. The journey took 7 days. They traveled in covered Bedford lorries, 38 women packed onto wooden benches. The British gave them water twice daily, and hard biscuits that tasted like sawdust, but were more food than some had seen in weeks. They stopped at night in guarded compounds. No one touched them. No one threatened them. This only deepened their fear. The cruelty would come later, they told themselves. The British were waiting until they reached the main camp. Then the real horror would begin. During the journey, they whispered in the darkness. Margaret Clean, whose husband had died at Monte Cassino, insisted they must resist. "If they try to disown us, we fight. We die with dignity." She still wore her party membership pin hidden in her coat lining. She still believed. Inge Schultz wasn't sure anymore. She had been a telephone operator in Berlin, connecting calls between high command officers. She had heard things she wasn't supposed to hear. Conversations about retreats described as strategic withdrawals, casualty reports that never made it to public announcements. The gap between official truth and reality had grown too wide to ignore. Frieda said little. She had seen too much death to waste energy on speculation. Whatever came next would come. Rage wouldn't stop it. Faith wouldn't prevent it. She simply sat with her hands folded, watching the younger women wrestle with their terror. Leigh Sale prayed silently, clutching a small silver cross her grandmother had given her. She was 23 years old. She had never lived independently, never traveled beyond Germany, never questioned what she was told. Now she was a prisoner, traveling toward an unknown fate in the hands of an enemy she'd been taught to fear more than death itself. Then Greta collapsed in the gravel, blood spreading through her dress, and everything they believed began to crack. The ambulance that took her away wasn't theater. The medics who cut away her uniform weren't performing. The doctor who knelt in the rain wasn't pretending. They were genuinely trying to save her life. Why? The question haunted the remaining 37 women as British soldiers led them toward the processing tents. If the enemy was truly barbaric, why save one bleeding German woman? If the British were the hypocrites they'd been warned about, why were there medical personnel instead of executioners? One answer was possible. Everything they had been told was a lie. But if that was true, what else were lies? The question was too vast, too dangerous. But as they walked through the rain toward the tents, passing British soldiers who looked tired rather than cruel, every woman felt it growing inside her. Doubt, small and terrible, and impossible to suppress. The tent smelled of wet canvas and disinfectant. The 37 women stood inside, blinking in the filtered gray light. Signs hung from support poles in both German and English. Registration, medical examination, supplies, distribution. Someone had taken the time to translate, that small detail registered in minds, trained to notice everything. A British woman sat behind a folding table with a typewriter. She wore a khaki uniform with Royal Army Medical Corps insignia and looked tired but professional. She spoke through an interpreter, a German-speaking British sergeant named Hoffman, who looked almost as uncomfortable as the prisoners. Name, age, unit, role, where you were captured. The questions were administrative, not accusatory. Simple, clinical. Leigh Sale went first because she was standing closest. Her voice shook as she gave her answers. The woman typed without looking up, her fingers quick and precise on the keys. When Leigh Sale finished, the woman glanced up briefly. No smile, no hostility, just acknowledgement. Next. One by one, they answered the same questions. The process took 90 minutes. No one was struck, no one was insulted, no one was threatened. It was simply bureaucracy, boring, methodical, and strangely normal. Then came the medical examinations. This was where the women expected the nightmare to begin. A ramp corporal led them behind a canvas partition. Liesl's hands began to shake. Margaret whispered fiercely to the woman beside her, "Stay strong. Show no fear." But when they stepped through the partition, they found something impossible. Female medical personnel, not male soldiers. Women, British women in crisp uniforms with IMC badges and Red Cross armbands. The senior medical officer was Captain Dorothy Ashford, perhaps 38 years old, with dark hair pinned severely back and calm, intelligent eyes. She spoke through Sergeant Hoffman in a voice that was firm but not harsh. "Each of you will be examined for injuries and illness. This is required under the Geneva Convention. You will be treated with respect and dignity. If you are injured, you will receive medical care. If you are ill, you will receive medicine." The Geneva Convention again. The words kept appearing like an incantation, like something that actually mattered. "You will undress behind privacy screens," Captain Ashford continued. "One at a time. You will be given a gown. The examination will be conducted by female medical staff only. Male personnel will not be present. Privacy screens." Leigh Sale was motioned forward first. A nurse led her to a section divided by canvas sheets hanging from a metal frame. The nurse handed her a cotton examination gown, then turned her back, gave her privacy. Leigh Sale stood frozen, holding the gown, unable to process what was happening. For 3 years, she had lived in crowded barracks where privacy didn't exist. She had changed clothes in rooms packed with 60 other women. She had used latrines with no doors, no partitions, no dignity. Privacy was a luxury from a previous life. Now, a British nurse was offering it to a German prisoner. Slowly, Leigh Sale removed her filthy uniform. The nurse kept her back turned until Leigh Sale whispered, "Fertig, ready." The examination was thorough but gentle. The nurse checked her eyes, ears, throat, listened to her heart and lungs with a stethoscope, asked questions through the interpreter about pain, injuries, previous illnesses. When she found lice in Liesl's hair, inevitable after weeks without proper washing, she didn't recoil in disgust. She simply made a note on a chart. "Delousing treatment will be provided after bathing." Sergeant Hoffman translated, "Standard procedure for all incoming personnel. You'll also receive clean clothing and underwear." One by one, the others went through the same process. Some emerged with bandages on wounds they'd been hiding. Others received medications for infections, respiratory problems, malnutrition symptoms. Frida, with her nursing training, watched the British procedures with professional attention. She recognized proper protocols, organized record-keeping, genuine medical care. This wasn't performance. This was real medicine delivered according to standards she'd learned before the war, before everything became compromise and improvisation. When her turn came, the examining nurse was Lieutenant Sarah Peaton, older, perhaps 42, with grey streaking her blonde hair. She worked competently and without judgment. At the end, she did something unexpected. She placed a hand on Frida's shoulder and spoke. The interpreter relayed, "You're going to be fine, all of you. We'll take care of you properly." Frida's throat tightened. She managed a stiff nod. Lieutenant Peaton smiled briefly before moving to the next patient. After medical examinations came the part they had dreaded most. They were led to another building, wooden and long with steam rising from vents. A bathhouse. This was it. This was where the humiliation would happen. Mass bathing. No privacy. Guards watching. All the warnings about British depravity would prove true. But inside they found individual stalls. 10 of them, each separated by wooden partitions. Hooks on walls held thick towels. On benches sat stacks of clean clothing, simple cotton shirts, trousers, underwear, socks, and soap, real soap. Bars of pale soap that smelled faintly of lavender stacked beside each clothing pile like small miracles. Inga picked one up and turned it over in her hands. She hadn't seen real soap in 18 months. The Rai had been using substitute soap made from clay and industrial chemicals that stripped skin raw and left it cracked and bleeding. This was smooth, gentle, and smelled like something from before the war, from when life was normal. A RAM nurse demonstrated the baths through Sergeant Hoffman. Hot water was available. They could take as much time as needed. No one would rush them. No one would watch. There were privacy curtains they could pull closed. Lei Sale entered a stall first, pulled the curtain shut, and stood in the small private space, trembling. Then she turned the tap. Hot water poured over her. She gasped, then began to cry. She couldn't help it. The water was perfect, clean, and hot and endless. She picked up the soap and worked it between her hands. The scent of lavender filled the small space, overwhelming, beautiful, impossible. For the first time in months, she felt almost human. Around her. In other stalls, similar moments unfolded. Women wept under the spray. Others laughed in disbelief, the sound echoing off tile walls. Margaret stood under the water in silence, her face unreadable, her ideology cracking under the simple weight of hot water and real soap. When they emerged, clean and dressed in fresh clothes, hair wet and smelling of soap, they barely recognized each other. Frida stood before a small mirror mounted on the wall. She had expected to see a broken woman. Instead, she saw someone who looked merely exhausted, someone who might possibly recover. The soap sat in her hand, a small pale rectangle that had somehow become a symbol of something larger. Humanity standards. The possibility that everything they'd been taught was wrong. That evening they were led to dinner. The mess hall was a large Nissen hut, curved corrugated metal with a concrete floor. Through the open doors the women could hear British soldiers talking, the clatter of metal trays. The scrape of cutlery. The smell that rolled out stopped several women in their tracks. Meat. Cooking meat. Real meat. Liesel's stomach contracted violently. She pressed her hand against it, fighting the wave of hunger that threatened to double her over. She hadn't smelled roasting meat in over a year. In Germany, meat rations had dropped to 200 g per week in 1944. By early 1945, there was often no meat at all, just watery soup, black bread full of sawdust, and potatoes when they were lucky. "Keep moving," a British corporal said. Not harsh, just directive. They entered the mess hall. It was enormous. Rows of long tables filled with British soldiers eating and talking. Some glanced at the German women. Most didn't. There was no special segregated area. No section marked for prisoners. They were simply directed to a serving line where food was being distributed. Inga went first, holding her metal tray with both hands that shook slightly. A server, a British private with a stained apron, placed food on her tray without comment or ceremony. Potatoes. Real potatoes mashed with butter, steaming and white, not the rotted scraps they'd been eating. Vegetables. Carrots and peas. Recognizable, properly cooked, actually colored instead of the gray mush that had passed for vegetables in recent months. Meat. A slice of something that looked like pork in gravy. Actual meat. Dark and thick, not the mysterious tins of preserved fat that had been their protein for years. Bread, white bread, fresh, still warm, soft as a cloud. Butter, real butter in a small paper cup, yellow and rich tea, a cup of hot tea with milk and sugar, and on the side, almost casually, a piece of tinned pineapple. Ing stared at the pineapple as if it were made of gold. Fresh fruit had disappeared from Germany in 1943. Tinned fruit had become a distant memory. Pineapple was something from childhood, from holidays, from a world that no longer existed. She moved to a table in a daze. The other women followed, each receiving the same impossible portions. They sat together at the end of a long table, staring at their trays in silence. No one ate. Margaret spoke first, her voice low and bitter. "It's psychological warfare. They're showing us abundance to break our morale, to make us feel the rice failure." But even as she said it, her eyes were locked on the meat. Her hand gripped her fork so tightly her knuckles went white. Frida picked up her fork. As a nurse, she had learned pragmatism. Starving herself to prove ideological loyalty was stupidity. She cut a small piece of meat and placed it in her mouth. She chewed slowly, her eyes closing. It was real. Properly cooked, properly seasoned, actual pork. Not horse meat or worse. Not the mystery tins of rendered fat that tasted like machine oil. This was food. Real food. A single tear rolled down her cheek. That was all the permission the others needed. They began to eat slowly at first, then faster as their bodies remembered what nourishment meant. Some cried while eating. Others ate in focused silence, their entire being concentrated on the act of filling their shrunken stomachs. Lei Sail ate 4 bites of potato before she had to stop. Her stomach shrunk from months of deprivation. Couldn't handle more. She sat breathing heavily, staring at the half-full tray, overwhelmed. The bread was hardest to accept. Inge held the slice in both hands, feeling its softness. In Berlin, bread rations had been cut to 300 grams per day in 1945, and that was black bread, dense and often moldy, mixed with sawdust to extend supplies. This was white bread, soft, fresh, the kind of bread that hadn't existed in Germany since 1942. She took a bite and nearly sobbed at the taste. Across the table, Lei Sail whispered in German, "How can they have so much? We were told Britain was starving, that their economy had collapsed, that rationing had broken them. But this," she gestured at her tray at the half-eaten meal that represented more food than she'd seen in weeks. "This isn't starvation. This is plenty." The observation settled over the table like a weight. It was undeniable. Everything they'd been told about Britain, that it was on the verge of collapse, that rationing had destroyed civilian morale, that the nation was one step from starvation, was being demolished with every bite. The propaganda had promised them that German discipline and sacrifice would outlast British weakness. But Germany was starving in ruins, while Britain had enough food to feed enemy prisoners like this. The pineapple became symbolic. Lei Sail held hers with trembling fingers, unable to bring herself to eat it. The yellow fruit glistened in its syrup. She brought it to her nose and inhaled. The sweet scent was almost painful. Finally, she placed it in her mouth. The sweetness exploded across her tongue, overwhelming after years of bland food. Juice ran down her chin. She didn't care. She ate slowly, making it last, while tears streamed down her face. A British soldier at a nearby table noticed. He was young, maybe 21, with dark hair and kind eyes. He caught Liesel's gaze and gave a small, respectful nod. Not mocking, not cruel, just human acknowledgement. She looked away, ashamed of her tears, ashamed of her hunger, ashamed that the enemy had given her tinned pineapple, and she had devoured it with gratitude. That night, back in their assigned barracks, a long wooden hut with real beds and real mattresses and real blankets, the women lay in the darkness, and struggled with what they'd experienced. Margaret spoke into the silence, her voice hard, but lacking conviction. "They're trying to make us forget. They feed us so we'll feel grateful, so we'll betray everything we believed in." No one answered immediately. Then Frieda's voice came, quiet, but clear. "Or perhaps they're simply following their own rules. The Geneva Convention requires adequate food for prisoners. Maybe this isn't strategy. Maybe this is simply what civilized nations do, even for enemies. Especially for enemies, because that's what separates civilization from barbarism." The words hung in the darkness. Outside the camp was quiet except for distant voices and the sound of lorries moving supplies. 37 German women lay in clean beds, their stomachs fuller than they'd been in months, their minds wrestling with truths that refused to fit into the framework they'd carried across Germany. The enemy had shown them mercy, and that mercy was harder to bear than cruelty would have been, because cruelty they understood. Cruelty they'd been prepared for. Cruelty fit the narrative. Mercy required them to see their captives as human. And once you saw your enemy as human, everything became complicated. Morning came with a whistle, sharp and precise. The women woke in their beds, disoriented for a moment before memory returned. They were prisoners. But they had slept in real beds with real pillows. The barracks was cool, but not freezing. Light came through windows that actually had glass. A schedule was posted on the wall, printed in both German and English. 0630 wake 0700 breakfast 0800 work assignments 112,200 lunch 1300 work continue 1700 free time 1800 dinner 2100 lights out. It was regimented but not cruel. It was simply order. The kind of structure military life had always followed. Workers' assignments were light. Some women were sent to the camp kitchen to help prepare meals. Others worked in the laundry, washing linens and uniforms. A few, including Frieda with her nursing background, were asked to assist in the camp infirmary, caring for British soldiers who'd been wounded in the final days of fighting. But what shocked them most wasn't the work. It was what happened on the fourth day. Each woman received an envelope containing camp script paper money that could be spent only in the camp canteen. The amounts were small, equivalent to about £1 per week, but the principle was staggering. They were being paid for their labor. Instead, at the notes in her hand, as if they might dissolve. This makes no sense. We're prisoners. Why would they pay us? Sergeant Hoffman, the interpreter, explained matter-of-factly. Geneva Convention, Article 62. Prisoners of war shall be paid for their work. It's international law. The law. As if law still meant something. As if rules applied even to enemies. The canteen was another revelation. A small building where prisoners could buy cigarettes, writing paper, stamps, soap, chocolate, even magazines. The prices were low, affordable with their wages. On her 5th day, Inga bought a bar of Cadbury chocolate. She spent 2 shillings, a quarter of her week's earnings, on something frivolous, something sweet. She ate it slowly in the barracks that evening, letting each square melt on her tongue, marveling at the taste of real chocolate after years of nothing. Leigh Sale used her money to buy writing paper and stamps. Letters were allowed, though censored. She wrote to her mother in careful script, "Lee Mutie, I am alive. I am in a British camp near Bremen. I am being treated according to international law. Please do not worry. I hope you are safe and have enough to eat. I do not know when I will return, but I am well. I think of you every day. Your loving daughter, Leigh Sale." She didn't mention the soap, the hot water, the chocolate, the pineapple, the tea with milk and sugar. Those truths were too complicated for a censored letter. How could she explain that she was living better as a prisoner than her mother likely was as a free woman in the ruins of Germany? The library was Liesel's discovery. It was a small room in one of the administration huts lined with shelves holding books in several languages. A sign on the door read 14001190 daily. The librarian was Mrs. Helen Davies, a Red Cross volunteer in her 50s with grey hair pulled back in a bun and eyes that held both kindness and immense weariness. She sat behind a desk, stamping return cards and organizing shelves. Leigh Sale entered nervously, uncertain if prisoners were truly allowed. Mrs. Davies looked up and smiled. Not a forced smile, a genuine one. "Come in, dear. Are you looking for something to read?" Leigh Sale didn't understand all the English words, but the gesture was clear. Mrs. Davies stood and began pulling books from shelves, English primers, German novels, picture magazines. Through Sergeant Hoffman, who happened to be passing, Leigh Sale asked a question that had been weighing on her. "Why would you help us? We were your enemy." The translator hesitated before conveying it, but Mrs. Davies's expression softened. She answered slowly so the translation would be clear. "My son died in France in 1944. He was 23 years old, a lieutenant in the Durham Light Infantry." She paused, her hands resting on a stack of books. "Hating you won't bring him back. But maybe teaching you English, maybe helping you learn something. Maybe that builds something better than what we had. Maybe that's what he would have wanted for the future to be different than the past." Leigh Sale stood silent, the books heavy in her arms. The idea that a woman who had lost her son to German bullets could choose grace over revenge violated everything she understood about human nature. 3 weeks after their arrival, Greta returned from the military hospital. The women gathered around her in the barracks, touching her arms to confirm she was real. She looked transformed, color in her cheeks, weight returning to her frame. The wound properly healed with clean dressings. "They gave me penicillin," Greta said, sitting on her bunk surrounded by her friends. "Real penicillin, not the substitute drugs we were using toward the end. They operated, cleaned the infection, stitched me properly." Major Hartley explained everything through an interpreter. "They asked my permission before each procedure." She placed her hand over the healing wound beneath her clean shirt. "I thought I was going to die. Part of me wanted to die because I thought death was better than what the British